Section 3 of Railroads from the Investor's Viewpoint by the Federal Securities Corporation. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recent History, Part 1. 2. Recent History, Situation during the World War. This brings our story down to the time that the United States entered the war. We are all more or less familiar with the problems which the railroads were asked to face at that time. We know of the labor situation and the increasing scale of prices which confronted railroads in 1917 as a result of the World War in Europe. Traffic, of course, had been tremendous during 1916, which was one of the most prosperous years in the annals of railroad history of the United States. This prosperity continued during the early part of 1917, but the situation changed at the time of our entry into the war. Notwithstanding the large volume of traffic which the roads were carrying, the railroad situation, due to the rising costs of labor, of material, and of money, in the spring of 1917 became acute. There was a large shortage of equipment of all kinds due to the heavy traffic, as well as an insufficient and inefficient labor supply at high costs. As a result, the margin of net earnings showed a declining tendency, and there appeared to be an impending demoralization of railroad credit. In addition, the political attitude toward the railroads was most uncertain, a condition that added further perplexities to the situation. The net result was that during the 9 months of war preceding government operation of the railroads, the situation was uncertain and critical. It was recognized by the government, the railroad companies, and the public at large that, upon our entrance into the war, the interests of the railroad companies should be made subservient to the general welfare of the country and to the plan of moving all things toward a favorable termination of the war as early as possible. The companies voluntarily surrendered their individual initiative and independence because it seemed necessary as a war measure, but in doing so floundered about in a sea of irresponsible and inexperienced centralized direction and were given little or no assurance of financial or corporate independence. We all know that under this system the difficulties of operation multiplied to an extent that made government operation not only a military necessity for the country, but a financial necessity for the roads. It is said that private operation under military necessity could hardly have been continued without at least financial demoralization of the roads and perhaps general bankruptcy. True, it was recognized that the taking over the railroads of the country by the government would be attended with certain serious evils. It was recognized that it might result in laxity of executive direction, in inefficiency of operation on the part of labor, in increased costs of operation with decreasing earnings, as well as in deterioration of equipment and roadbed. All of these things we know actually did result from government control, and yet it was probably the only course which could have been pursued from the standpoint of the good of the country and the good of the roads as a whole. Federal operation. The roads were taken over by the government on January 1st, 1918. They were rented by the government at a rental which amounted to the average net operating earnings of each road for the 3 years preceding government control. The year 1915 was not a very good year for the roads. 1916, on the other hand, was one of the best years they had ever had. 1917 was an average year. An average of the net earnings of all 3 years was considered to be a very fair allowance for the roads during the period of government control. A contract to this effect was made by the government with each railroad separately and individually. There were some cases where this general arrangement seemed to be unfair to the roads, as in the case of the Western Pacific, which had just gone through receivership and had had practically no net earnings during the 3 years previous to government control. In situations like this, where the railroad objected to the plan of government rental, the cases were taken up by a referee and decided individually. The period during government control can probably be passed over very quickly because the results of such operation are more or less fresh in our minds. It was necessary for the government, of course, to have absolute control of traffic, to give preference to shipment of troops and of war materials, and to make the interest of shippers secondary. Traffic was diverted from customary channels. Certain roads were asked to take care of an unusually heavy density of traffic. On others, the traffic was lighter than under ordinary conditions. This could not but result in inefficiencies of operation by reason of congestion of traffic in certain spots and thinness in certain others. One unfortunate result was that because a road had no responsibility, it was not as particular as formerly in getting foreign cars out of its hands and back to the owning railroad. The roads were under-equipped and the equipment under-maintained. When the railroads were taken over, the freight cars and other equipment generally were in poor condition because of the universal labor shortage. Because of the carpooling arrangement under government control, there was little incentive for operating officials to keep their cars in repair since only a small percentage of each company's cars would remain on its own line. This situation could not but contribute to a general freight car and passenger car deterioration, especially since, under pressure, cars and locomotives were often kept on the rails when they should have been in the repair shops. Moreover, during the 26 months of government control, only 100,000 new freight cars and 1,900 new locomotives were ordered and put into use. Prior to federal control, the average production of freight cars each 12 months had been 100,000, so that there was a greater shortage of car equipment at the end of federal control than at the beginning. Moreover, all costs, as everyone no doubt remembers, including labor and materials, were increased tremendously during the period of the war, whereas freight rates were increased almost not at all until the war was practically over. The total rental which was necessary for the government to pay in each year amounted to about $950 million. In 1919, when the net operating income of the railroads was less than $550 million, the loss to the government in operating the roads was over $400 million. The final result, according to the report of Director General Hines made to President Wilson on February 28, 1920, was that this was in excess of operating expenses and rentals over operating revenue for 26 months, amounting to $715,500,000. We mention this merely to show the tremendous increases in labor and operating costs to the railroad companies without corresponding increases in rates. The roads were in government hands for 26 months. On March 1, 1920, at the time they were turned back to private ownership, Director General Hines of the Railroad Administration issued a statement in which he briefly analyzed the operation under government control. He said he knew the government had been severely criticized because of the deficit which had been incurred, but he pointed out that the cost of transportation had to be paid in one way or another, and that it was exactly the same whether the money was taken out of the people in the form of taxes or in the form of increased freight rates. As it was, the medium of taxation was chosen because of the unsettling effect large increases in freight rates would have had on business generally. It was necessary that all business should go forward as smoothly as possible because of the great need for manufactured articles of all kinds during and because of the war. It did not seem politic to increase freight rates, but since the increased costs of labor and of materials increased costs of operation to the point of a deficit, it became necessary to make up the deficit in the form of taxes. In justification of his position, Director Hines drew an analogy between the history of the operation of the railroads during the war and the history of the operation of the United States Steel Corporation. The steel company's operating costs from 1914 to 1918 increased 150%, whereas the operating costs of the railroads increased 102%. The cost per unit, moreover, of the steel company's product increased 61%, whereas the railroad's cost per unit of traffic increased 60%. Mr. Hines further pointed out that certain situations, over which he had no control, greatly increased the cost of transportation for the government. For example, the increase in rates granted in June of 1918 should have been granted long before that time. If it had been granted in January instead, the net advantage to the roads would have been about $494 million. Again, we all remember the coal strike which took place in the fall of 1919, the results of which were not chargeable to the government, but which cost the government $114 million net in operating the carriers. Further than this, the deficit of about $400 million, which occurred in operating the railroads in 1919, was in very large part occasioned by the extraordinary slump in freight business in the first 6 months of that year. Mr. Hines estimated the deficit in these 6 months at $292,500,000, as against a total deficit for the year of about $400 million. The deficit during the first 6 months is not properly chargeable to government operation because the war was over and the slump in traffic would have been there just the same, whether the roads themselves or the government were operating the carriers. All told, while the operation of the roads by the government was a costly procedure, it would seem that under the circumstances, results were as good as could have been expected. Under wartime conditions, it was necessary that the public generally should pay for the cost of forced transportation under trying conditions, and the method chosen to make this payment was probably just as good as, if not better than, any other that was possible. Individual showings during government control. It is very interesting to study the results of the various railroad companies during the 26 months of government control, because it is a pertinent indication of the strength and earning capacity of the various properties. A road must not be judged, of course, on this showing alone, because in the case of many, influences over which the managers of the property had no control tended toward a poor showing. However, those roads which, in spite of generally increased costs, and in spite of inadequate increases in freight rates, were able to earn amounts equal to or even exceeding the amounts of the government rental, are clearly shown to be strong properties, at least during the period of government control. The fact that during 1918 and 1919 both the Atchison and Union Pacific earned amounts greater than the government rental is a most interesting commentary on the financial strength of these two systems. The Michigan Central also is in this class, as well as the Nickel Plate, the Pierre Marquette, and the Big Four. The Oregon Short Line, which is really part of the Union Pacific, also in both years earned more than its guarantee. The Western Pacific, too, falls into this class, probably only because it had just passed through a receivership period of small earnings. The Delaware, Lackawanna, and Western, the Chesapeake and Ohio, the Atlantic Coastline, the Louisville and Nashville, the Southern, the St. Louis and San Francisco, and the St. Louis Southwestern were among the roads which earned more than their guarantee in one of the 2 years. The Southern roads generally made a very good showing because of the fact that the army camps were located in the South, occasioning a large increase in traffic during those years. The New York Central earned almost its guarantee during both years, but made a better showing in 1919 than in 1918. The Norfolk and Western also made a good showing in both years. The Chicago, Burlington and Quincy, the Southern Pacific, the Northern Pacific, the Rock Island, the Denver and Rio Grande, as well as the Kansas City Southern and Texas and Pacific, fall into the same group of roads which made a very good showing but fell short of earning their guarantee during 2 years. On the other hand, certain roads which one would ordinarily expect to make a better showing did rather poorly. The Illinois Central earned $12,900,000 in 1918 and only $4 million in 1919, as compared with a government guarantee of $16 million. The Great Northern earned about $12 million in both years, as compared with a government guarantee of over $28 million. The Chicago and Northwestern similarly earned about $12 million each year, as compared with a rental of over $23 million. The Philadelphia and Reading, which also is a strong road and should be classed with the others just mentioned, earned $11 million in 1918, and only $5 million in 1919, as compared with a guarantee of over $17 million. It is not surprising, of course, that the New England roads did not do very well. The New Haven, with a standard return of about $17 million, earned $7,700,000 in 1918, and $6,900,000 in 1919. The Boston and Maine earned $1,895,000 in 1918 and $3,577,000 in 1919, compared with a rental of $9,832,000. The Boston and Albany earned about half its guarantee, and the Maine Central showed a deficit in both years. The Delaware and Hudson and the Lehigh Valley, both of which are anthracite roads, and which might be expected to make a good showing, did relatively quite poorly. The Central of New Jersey, also an anthracite road, made a fair showing in 1918 with net earnings of $6 million, but in 1919 fell off with earnings of only $1,400,000, as compared with a guarantee of over $9 million. The Pennsylvania lines, both east and west, did not show very well during the war. The eastern lines were guaranteed $51 million net, whereas in 1918 the earnings were only about $19,900,000, and in 1919 a little over $8 million. The lines west of Pittsburgh showed $4,400,000 net in 1918 and $5,700,000 in 1919, compared with a $14 million guarantee. It is not surprising, of course, that roads like the Wabash, the Chicago Great Western, the Seaboard Airline, and the Missouri Pacific should not do as well as some of the other roads, but the poor showing of the Chicago, Milwaukee, and St. Paul is probably the greatest surprise of all. This road earned only $3,900,000 in 1918 and $3,200,000 in 1919, as compared with a government guarantee of almost $27,900,000. The Transportation Act. On March 1, 1920, as we have previously mentioned, the roads were turned back to their original owners. Mr. Wilson in 1919 had promised that he would turn the roads over to their owners on January 1, 1920. He frankly said that he did not know how this was to be done, but he hoped that certain legislation would be put through by Congress so that this might be effected. A railroad bill had been in preparation in the House, as a matter of fact, by Mr. John J. Eschke of Wisconsin, and in the Senate by Mr. Cummings of Iowa. The problem resolved itself into effecting a compromise between the two bills, and during the first week in February, the conferees came to an agreement. On February 18th, the bill was completed in conference, and the legislation proposed by the conferees was reported to the Senate and to the House, passed, and finally signed on February 28, 1920. The bill, as it is now in operation, contains the following provisions. 1. Freight and passenger rates so to be adjusted by the Interstate Commerce Commission as to yield the carriers for the 2-year period beginning March 1, 1920, a return of 5.5% on the aggregate value of railroad property, with permission on the part of the Interstate Commerce Commission to make this allowed return 6%, the additional 0.5% to be used for non-productive maintenance, betterments, and equipment. 2. 1/2 of a railroad's net operating income in excess of 6% of its property value to be distributed equally between the road's reserve fund and the Federal Railroad Contingent Fund, the latter to be administered by the Commission for the Assistance of Weaker Roads. 3. The government to continue its guarantee of standard return to all the roads for 6 months after the date of resumption of private operation up to September 1, 1920, rates and fares as well as wages not to be reduced prior to that date without the consent of the Interstate Commerce Commission. 4. Permission to be granted to consolidate the railroads of the country in accordance with a general consolidation plan to be prepared by the Interstate Commerce Commission. 5. All labor disputes to be submitted to a permanent federal board appointed by the President to be composed of 9 members, 3 representing the employees, 3 representing the railroads, and 3 representing the public. 6. $300 million to be appropriated as a revolving fund for the purpose of making loans to the railroads and of paying claims to them on account of disputes arising out of federal control, the railroads to pay interest on the money so loaned at the rate of 6%. The bill originally provided that this was to be paid back in 5 years, but on June 5, 1920, by amendment, the time was extended to 15 years. It will be seen that by the provisions of this bill, each road was guaranteed for 6 months a return equal to that which it received under government control. After September 1, 1920, the bill did not guarantee any return whatsoever. It merely authorized the Interstate Commerce Commission to regulate rates and fares by geographical districts in such a way as to yield 5.5% on the aggregate fair value of all the railroad property investment in each district. The Interstate Commerce Commission has divided the country into 4 districts: the Eastern, the Southern, the Mountain Pacific, and the Western districts. In a general way, the Eastern District includes the railroads north of the Ohio River and east of the Mississippi River. The Southern District includes those roads south of the Ohio River and east of the Mississippi. The Western District is the area west of the Mississippi and east of an irregular line drawn through what is called the Denver Points, while the Mountain Pacific District includes those roads west of the Western District to the Pacific Coast. Each of these districts contains weak as well as strong roads, but the bill does not mean that each road, strong or weak, is guaranteed 5.5% on its value as determined by the Commission. It means that rates should be so adjusted that the return will be 5.5% on the aggregate property value of all the railroads in each district. This would probably mean more than 5.5% for the strong roads and less than that for the weak. After 6% has been earned by a railroad upon its fair value without regard for other income, the excess over this amount shall be divided between the railroad which earned the excess and the railroad contingent fund. This fund is to be used either for making loans to the carriers or for the purchase of equipment to be leased to the carriers. In either case, the government is to receive from the railroad 6% on the amount so invested. The railroad's share of the surplus above 6% of the property value is to be placed in a trust fund for the purpose of building up a surplus for the road until this fund equals 5% of the property value of any particular carrier, after which the road is privileged to use it for any purpose it desires. This fund may be used for making up interest or dividends during those years when the carrier's earnings are less than the required amount. Private operation. Such was the situation when, on March 1st, the railroads were turned over to their private owners. Under government ownership, it is said that the railroad expenses increased over $1.5 billion a year. Whatever the amount was, the roads were left with a real legacy of enormously increased expenses, with properties that were in poorer shape than when they were turned over, and with less, and in many cases much poorer, equipment. The railroads were faced with the serious problem of meeting the situation of poor condition of roadbed and equipment, with expenses and labor costs constantly increasing. The employees during the first 6 months of private operation were negotiating for higher wages. On April 16th, the first meeting of the Labor Board under the Transportation Act was called, and on July 20th, this board announced at Chicago that wage increases had been awarded, which was estimated at the time would add $600 million to the operating expenses of the roads. While these negotiations were going on, the roads themselves were negotiating for increased rates, and on May 24th, hearings were opened by the Interstate Commerce Commission. On July 29th, the Interstate Commerce Commission granted the railroads increases in freight and passenger rates, which it was then estimated would yield about $1.5 billion additional revenue per year to the carriers. The new rates to become effective on August 26th. Under the decision of the Commission, the roads in the Eastern District were authorized to increase their freight rates 40%, those in the Southern and Mountain Pacific Districts 25%, and those in the Western District 35%. The Commission also authorized the carriers to advance passenger rates 20%, Pullman rates 50%, and excess baggage and milk rates 20%. Rate increases. The report of the Commission at the time these rate increases were authorized is a very interesting document. The problem which was presented to them was to fix rates for the railroads in the different groups at such a figure that for the 2-year period ending March 1st, 1922, they would yield at least 5.5% on the fair value of the aggregate physical property of the roads in a given district. The first thing to ascertain and establish, therefore, was the aggregate value of the railway property of the carriers held and used in the service of transportation. The valuation work of the railroads under the Interstate Commerce Commission Act was still incomplete, but the work had progressed so far that the results were of great value in reaching the determination which the Commission needed as a basis. From the valuations which had been made and other evidence which was submitted, as well as information which the Commission had obtained, the Commission determined that the total value of the steam railway property for their purpose was approximately $18.9 billion, divided as follows: Eastern Group, $8.8 billion, Southern Group, $2 billion, Western and Mountain Pacific Group, $8.1 billion. The carriers themselves asked for rates which capitalized on the basis of a 6% return, which would make the value of the properties in excess of $20.5 billion, and they actually carried the cost of road and equipment on their books at a figure in excess of $20 billion. The Eastern carriers asked that they be permitted to earn an annual net railway operating income of $559,409,933, which would represent 6% on the book cost of $9,323,498,898. The figures for 1919 showed that the rates in effect at the time the investigation was going on would fall short $500 million annually of earning the net railway operating income to which they claimed they were entitled. The Commission recognized that not only had there been a sharp decline in railway operating income during the previous 3 or 4 years, but also that the operating ratio had increased at, quote, a rate that causes serious concern, end quote. For the 5 years prior to 1916, the operating ratio of the Eastern carriers was 71%. This had increased to 75% in 1917, to almost 86% in 1918, to 88.5% in 1919, and 97.68% in the first 4 months of 1920. This means that during the first 4 months of 1920, after paying operating expenses, there was left only 2.32 cents out of each dollar for the payment of interest on funded debt, taxes, and other items such as rents, hire of equipment, leases, etc., and short for the payment of fixed charges. During the 6-year period beginning with 1912, it took approximately 28.79 cents out of every dollar of operating revenue to pay these fixed charges, so that the need of the Eastern carriers for an increase in rates was immediately apparent. In addition to the above, it will be recalled that in July 1920, the Labor Board placed in effect a general increase in wages, which was estimated would add approximately $314,500,000 annually to the operating expenses of the carriers in the Eastern Group. This entire situation, in the opinion of the Commission, could be met by a 40% increase in freight rates and by the other increases previously rehearsed. In the Southern Group as a whole, the situation was much more favorable. The carriers in this group asked that their rates be increased so that they might earn net $136,049,091, which represents a return of 6% on a value of $2,267,484,847. The roads in the Southern Group estimated that under the schedule of rates in effect at the beginning of 1920, their operating income would be approximately $120 million less than this sum. The operating expenses in this group had, like those in the Eastern District, increased heavily, but not to the same extent. During the 6 years ended 1917, the operating ratio of the Southern carriers varied from 65% in 1916 to 74% in 1914. In 1918, it was 77 2/3%. In 1919, it had advanced to 86%, and for the first 4 months of 1920 was 86.22%. The roads in this group asked for an increase of approximately 31% in freight revenue and reached an advance of 25% in freight together with the general advance in passenger and Pullman rates previously outlined. In the Western and Mountain Pacific groups, the carriers requested that their rates be fixed on a basis to permit them to earn $537,833,024, which represents a 6% return on $8,963,883,753. On the basis of the prediction of the carriers, the operating income of these districts would fall short approximately $350 million of the amount to which they believed they were entitled. The operating ratio of the roads in these groups had increased similarly with those in the other two groups. This ratio, which between 1912 and 1917 had ranged from 63% to 68%, had advanced to 81% in 1919. And to 86.6% for the first 4 months of 1920. In taking the various figures of the roads in this group and adjusting them to the standard set by the Interstate Commerce Commission, it was determined that the return stipulated under the Ash-Cummings bill could be earned through an increase for the Western group of 35% in freight rates and for the Mountain Pacific group of 25%, together with the general increases in passenger and other rates. In the opinion of the Interstate Commerce Commission, these increases in rates, both freight and passenger, would yield at least 5.5% on the total valuation of the railroads of the country as determined by them. In this connection, it is very interesting to note that the aggregate valuation the Commission placed on the properties not only covers all of the funded debt of the railroads at par, but also covers all the capital stock of the railroads at par and leaves a margin of about $2 billion besides. In other words, in the opinion of the Commission, the roads are today conservatively worth $2 billion more than their entire capitalization. End of section 3. Read by Elsie Selwyn.